Good evening. You're watching World News Tonight here on TVP World. I'm your host, Diana Skaya. Donald Trump's re-election as 47th President of the United States has sparked strong reactions across Europe. Now, in today's episode, we're going to look into some of those immediate responses, and later, our guest Ian Brzezinski will share insights on how Trump's presidency could shape the future of Europe. Now, more on that in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Germany's governing coalition has collapsed after Chancellor Olaf Scholz fired a key minister. European leaders gathered in Budapest to face up to Donald Trump's victory in U.S. elections. Who will President-elect choose as his cabinet members? The list of top contenders in just a minute. Germany is in a huge political crisis. Now, the country's three-party ruling coalition has collapsed after Chancellor Olaf Scholz dismissed his finance minister on Wednesday. Snap elections are expected early next year. But now, what does this mean for Poland and the region? Our Kazimierz Łysiak reports.
While Donald Trump was celebrating his victory on Wednesday, others were hardly in a celebratory mood. Germany's three-party ruling coalition has run its course.
I have just asked the president for the dismissal of the finance minister. I feel forced to take this step in order to avert damage from our country.
Chancellor Olaf Scholz is being challenged by this man, Finance Minister Christian Lindner, the leader of the Liberal Free Democrats Party.
This afternoon, the Chancellor gave me an ultimatum to suspend the constitutional debt brake. I couldn't do that because I would have been breaking my oath of office. Therefore, the Chancellor has terminated the cooperation with me and the FDP.
The constitutional break mentioned by the finance minister means the balanced budget amendment, a fiscal rule intended to limit public debt and deficit. Since late 2023, the budget has been the main bone of contention between the coalition parties.
In the opinion of the Liberals, the idea of having a balanced budget is way more important than any other subject. On Scholz's side, there are at least two other factors. The first one is, of course, the issue of security. And the second thing is the idea of spending way more on social benefits is important in order to gain votes.
The coalition up until now has consisted of Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats, or SDP, Christian Lindner's Liberal FDP, and the climate-oriented Greens. According to Bartłomiej Kot, the collapse of the German coalition is unlikely to influence Ukraine that much.
There is some idea from Scholz's side as to convince actually the opposition party CDU so to gain support in order at least to provide Ukraine with the necessary financial aid. And they are not against supporting Ukraine.
Germany is Europe's largest economy and the third largest in the world after the United States and China, at 4.2 trillion euro of GDP. It's also the largest exporter of goods to Poland at 67.5 billion euro, according to Poland's State Statistics Agency. We asked Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski whether he sees the German political crisis as a reason for concern or an opportunity for Warsaw to take the lead in Europe, especially since Poland will be taking over the presidency in the Council of the European Union in the first half of 2025.
Coalition governments have their pleasures. Germany remains an important partner. Poland is we hope, an inspiration for others. The German Interior Minister has just been to the Polish border. We hope that Germany appreciates what we are doing for the whole Schengen zone.
Both the FDP and Germany's center-right CDU-SDU opposition are calling for snap elections in light of the ruling coalition's collapse. Chancellor Scholz announced he will call the vote of confidence on January 15th next year. If the vote fails, snap elections could take place in March. Donald Trump's victory in the US election could mean less funding for Ukraine. And since Germany is second to the US when it comes to both financial and military aid to Kyiv, the onus may fall on Berlin to increase its help. But it first needs to resolve its major political crisis. From Warsaw, TVP World, Kazimierz Łysiak.
With Donald Trump's re-election, Europe's attention is turning to how this could reshape the continent's future. And now, as dozens of EU leaders gather in Budapest, they now have a key opportunity to address the changes ahead, both on the continent and beyond. And now we're going to move to our correspondent, Aaron Damon, who is in the United States. Hello, Aaron. Now tell us, of course, how do you see Trump's potential return to office affecting his relationships with EU leaders? Has there been much talk about this there?
Well, good evening, Diana. It's certainly time for Europe's leaders to put their diplomatic cap on. Even if many of them wanted a Kamala Harris presidency, they know that they now have to keep this relationship warm. Volodymyr Zelensky has talked about having a, quote, excellent chat with Trump this week. Today, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, they got on the phone, and we've just had to hand that we're hearing Vladimir Putin has also congratulated Mr. Trump, and there has been concern around Donald Trump's cosy relationship with someone like Vladimir Putin. We've also heard Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni being talked about as Trump's natural interlocutor in Europe. So an interesting conversation going on around the relationship between Europe and Washington. Of course, this all comes amid great uncertainty. Trump has previously refused to even say if he wanted Ukraine to win, that he could potentially pull military aid out of the region, and that would leave Europe to fight its own battle. Not just that, though. Donald Trump has talked about this trade, this tariff war, that would also hit Europe really hard. And so the cozy calls have started. Hopefully for Europe, next year that will turn into smiles and handshakes as both sides of the political aisle, look to build relationships over the Atlantic.
That's right, Aaron. What we saw there while you're also speaking was images of Meloni, also reportedly that Trump is really inspired by her approach to migration. Thank you so much, Aaron, from Washington, D.C. We'll be coming back to you later on in the day. Donald Trump's impending presidency, European defense, and support for Ukraine were the three topics that dominated the European policy meeting held in Budapest on Thursday. Now, the summit, called by Viktor Orban the biggest diplomatic event in the history of Hungary, was attended by leaders from more than 40 European countries. Pavel Trzaskowski has more.
Puskas Arena, a football stadium that can host over 60,000 spectators, attracted a much smaller crowd on Thursday. The European leaders convened in the Hungarian capital in a pivotal moment for the continent, with Viktor Orban as their host. Proposed by French President Emmanuel Macron in 2022 after the Russian invasion on Ukraine, the European political community is a forum for discussions on the future of Europe. Earlier this year, there were talks of some countries boycotting the event in response to Budapest's stance on migration. But with Trump just being elected president, the wind seems to have changed for the Hungarian leader.
It was particularly special to see all Europe gathered in the barn of its black ship, Victor.
The attendees, including leaders of the EU countries, the Balkan states, Turkey, but also Volodymyr Zelensky, first time in Budapest since the beginning of the war, all came with their own agendas.
We need sufficient weapons, not support in talks. Hugs with Putin will not help.
I believe that now there is a hope that we can start discussing, at least regarding Ukraine, something that we used to call a peace or a truce or a ceasefire.
I want to congratulate again President Trump.
Donald Tusk also attended the summit. Before the departure, the Polish Prime Minister said that Poland has clearly defined interests no matter global political changes.
The criteria I will stand by are protecting Polish interests regarding the economy, the standard of living in Poland, and Polish security.
But according to some experts, it was Viktor Orban, Trump's most ardent supporter in Europe, who probably benefited the most both from the Budapest meeting and US presidential elections. In an interview for TVP World, Tanya Domi from Columbia University pointed out that Orban and Trump have a lot in common.
He's repeatedly brought up Orban during the campaign, how much he likes him. And I would really call these people, including Vladimir Putin, these are the brothers in populism.
And in his final speech, the Hungarian Prime Minister used the limelight to talk in length on migration, an issue for which he has faced the most criticism.
Because it's obvious that almost in all countries, the majority of the people are against the illegal migration. And the national governments are not able to fulfill the request of the people.
The summit concluded on Thursday, but will be followed by an informal meeting of the European Council in Budapest on Friday. Mario Draghi's competitiveness report will be discussed, as well as transatlantic relations and the elections in Georgia.
Now, Ukrainian President Zelensky urged European leaders to adopt a peace-through-strength approach to security while speaking at the European Political Community Summit in Budapest on Thursday. Now, joining us live from Kiev with details is our Ukraine correspondent, Oz Chatterjee. Now, good evening. Oz, what more can you tell us about the summit?
Well, look, I mean, all of this needs to be taken in light, as the previous reporters have said, about Trump's incoming presidency. This may have been a very different speech had Kamala Harris won the presidency 2 days ago. So it's going to be a difficult time going forward for Europe, given the precedent that Trump has set in his previous administration. Zelensky here speaking that they should be under no illusions that peace can be bought by showing weakness. Suggesting again that Europe is not pulling its weight when it comes to supporting Ukraine and is showing weakness to an emboldened Putin. Zelensky also spoke, this in mind that the potential Trump administration may try and force territorial concessions onto Ukraine. He said it's unacceptable for Ukraine and suicide for all of Europe to entertain these kinds of ideas that would effectively reward Putin for invading Ukraine. Now, obviously, Zelensky was one of the first world leaders to contact President Trump to congratulate him on his victory. Kiev is going to be very concerned about maintaining those weapon supplies continuing into next year. We've got a very bitter winter coming up, and even if they're not getting offensive weapons from the United States, things like Patriot missiles used to shoot down, it's an air defense system. These are all made in the United States, so these are going to be really vital for Ukraine going forward. So this maintaining this relationship, this diplomacy now for Ukraine with the incoming Trump administration is going to be vital for Ukraine's war effort. If Trump pulls all support for Ukraine, this could be very, very worrying for Ukraine's prospects going forward.
And I mean, we heard even Zelensky say at the summit that hugging Putin is not what's going to aid Ukraine. Thank you so much, Oz Chatterjee, coming to us live from Kiev. Stay safe. 295 electoral votes. Now, with this impressive result, Donald Trump is poised to return to the White House. Let's now go live to Washington, D.C., where our own Don Arliff is on the ground in the U.S. Capitol. Hello, Don. So with elections now behind us, what do we know so far about who will form Trump's new cabinet? I mean, who's going to get to influence defense policy, foreign policy? Are we going to see Mike Pompeo, Elon Musk? What can you tell us?
Right. Well, I mean, when we're speculating about who's going to become in the next administration for now President-elect Donald Trump, definitely Elon Musk is the biggest name that comes up. Of course, he spent $119 million supporting the Trump campaign in swing states. He's going to be tapped to head the Department of Government Efficiency, something that has been talked about for quite some time now, and conduct a complete financial and performance audit of the federal government. Now, for us in Europe, we're really interested in who's going to be Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. You mentioned Mike Pompeo, and of course, he is definitely on the list to become potentially, the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of State, you have a few more names in there, such as Marco Rubio, Bill Hagerty, or Rick Grenell. Those are just some of the names, but I want to talk about Mr. Pompeo because he penned an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal some time ago over the summer, and he talked about a potential Trump strategy for Ukraine, none of it involving giving up land.
And Don, let's shift to something else now. So with Republicans having swept to the majority in the U.S. Senate, House is most likely to be next. Now, when will we know for sure? And what would this Republican dominance mean for U.S. policies?
Right, well, the states are still counting, so the latest numbers, according to AP, is 194 to 207 with 34 seats still up in the air. That's for the House of Representatives. So giving the Republicans a slight lead. If you look at some other sources, such as 270 to win, you have actually 200 to 213 with 22 seats still up in the air. No crystal ball when those counts are going to take place, but hopefully by the weekend, it should be complete. And the Senate looks like it's definitely going to the Republicans. With 52 seats, 2 are still up in the air, but leaning Democrat.
Thank you so much, Don Arleth, reporting to us live from Washington, D.C. With Donald Trump set to return to office in January, many are wondering what kind of entourage he'll bring with him to the White House. Now, perhaps the most discussed is the post of Secretary of State, as experts and media outlets both have already come up with their short list of potential candidates. Franciszek Pilis has more.
As Republicans across America enter full celebration mode after Donald Trump's commanding victory over the Democrats led by Kamala Harris, burning questions about who will be on his staff are starting to surface. Media outlet Politico, citing sources close to the president-elect, has published their shortlist of possible candidates for the post of Secretary of State, made up of 5 Trump loyalists. These are Rick Grenell, Bill Hagerty, Robert O'Brien, Marco Rubio, and Mike Waltz. But who exactly are these people? Up first, Richard Grenell, former U.S. ambassador to Germany and a man Trump refers to as his envoy. He's also served as the acting director of national intelligence under Trump and was considered to be one of the most influential advisors to Trump during his past term. Currently, he works as a senior advisor for a non-profit organization fighting Chinese influence in the U.S., but experts consider him a top contender for the job given his loyalty to Trump.
He was happy to protect Trump at a time when Trump was under great pressure, including over the first impeachment because of Trump's blackmail of Ukraine. So my starting point with Richard Grenell is that he does not fit in as someone who comes in to represent the U.S. system or U.S. diplomacy per se. He comes in to be a conveyor of Trump's views.
Hailing from Tennessee is the next potential candidate, Senator Bill Hagerty. Formerly part of the George H.W. Bush administration, he switched to the MAGA movement in 2016 and has been riding that train ever since. Before becoming a senator in 2020, he served as Trump's ambassador to Japan. Up next is Robert O'Brien. He stands out from the bunch as the only former Trump security advisor that hasn't had a falling out with the president-elect. His experience as Trump's hostage affairs envoy could prove useful given the current situation in Gaza. He's also seen as a big advocate for military aid to Ukraine, despite opposing a Ukrainian NATO membership, calling it too provocative.
In that kind of position, if you're Secretary of State, yes, you've got to march to the president's orders, but you also need to be giving him good, solid advice. And I hope that he stays true to his conventions and principles, which are being supportive of Ukraine and NATO. Time will tell. That's a great question, but unfortunately, we won't know the answer until he's given that chance and we see what kind of policy he formulates.
This new special law in America.
Marco Rubio, a former Trump opponent turned supporter and senator from Florida, is also considered for the job. Despite his hardline views on Iranian and Cuban issues, some say he's quite unlikely to remain in the race for long.
If Rubio does not serve Trump, if Rubio is seen to cross Trump, this is the man whom Donald Trump called Little Marco with derision during the 2016 presidential campaign. It's a person who Trump has been willing to insult in years after that. So, I'm not sure how much independence or autonomy Rubio would have as a Secretary of State.
Last but not least is Mike Waltz, a former Green Beret and one of the most active China hawks in Congress. He has previously heavily criticized the Biden administration's botched Afghanistan withdrawal and is an advocate for boosting oversight of taxpayer funding for military aid to Ukraine. While he's definitely a strong candidate for the job, experts say he's also likely to receive a different job in the Trump administration, like Secretary of Defense or a senior intelligence agency posting. For now, however, no one but the president-elect knows who will get what job in Trump's America, starting in January of next year.
European Parliament committees support Piotr Serafin's candidacy for the position of Budget Commissioner. Now, Serafin is a Brussels insider and close advisor to Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. The EU's upcoming budget will require balancing diverse national interests amid economic pressure. Now, Serafin's experience could be pivotal as the EU navigates one of its toughest financial negotiations in recent years. Sasha Farbach, our European Affairs correspondent, has this next report.
Now, as ever, this commissioner designate's role is all about the money, budget, the major budget known as the MFF. That'll be decisive for anything that moves Europe here. Now, that is going to be for the next 7 years, and the commissioner, Mr. Serafin, if he does indeed pass, will be in charge of that. Now, this is serious money. It's an ambitious project, but he already, when he was talking during his hearing, we heard very much about potentially shortening that time, making it not 7 years, but potentially even shorter. He was open about being more concise on that front, and also on where this money would go. Very much a man of the times, knowing full well that more needs to be done on the green transition, although he didn't name any numbers in terms of amount, but also making sure that this budget would, maybe surprisingly, be much bigger if it needs to tackle the problems and issues that the European Union faces. Now, at this point also, it's worth noting that Mr. Serafin is someone that very much is an insider here, that has experience with Brussels and the European Union. It was clear by speaking to some of those MEPs as they arrived here, there was a positive view that this is the right man for the job.
1% is definitely not enough. That's what I have said. And now there are many ways to work with the member states and to work for a higher budget, which is still a budget of unity. I was referring to own resources, but I also believe that in some areas, like competitiveness, like defense, member states are going to increase their spendings anyway. On defense and security, I have no doubt.
And also clear was when asked about what would be done for potentially having money for the external borders, money for Frontex. That's something that he agreed in principle with, so this would be also a very first. And also looking at defense in line with how money would go to making sure that the European Union had enough for the defense industry. And he did agree that there's not simply enough in the existing budget, and then he still is something that needs to be worked on, potentially even hinting at conversations more with the European Investment Bank, but he was fully aware of the problems and handled his hearing very much with a very, very professional attitude of someone who is in charge, who spoke his mind, but has a very also ambitious agenda with going on key values for the European Union. That's Sasha Farbach for TVP World in Brussels.
And now back to our main focus this evening. Now, as we look forward, the potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy, particularly in relation to Ukraine and NATO, there are key questions about how these changes are going to impact European security. And joining me now to discuss what Donald Trump's re-election could mean for Ukraine's stability, NATO's cohesion, and the broader geopolitical landscape and context, I'm pleased to welcome Ian Brzezinski, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Brzezinski, thank you so much for being with us here on World News Tonight on TVP World. So, sir,
Thank you for having me on.
I'm going to go straight right in. What can you tell us so far about who will form Trump's new cabinet and particularly his Secretary of State?
Well, I was listening, Diana, to your previous interviews, and I largely agree with what was said. I'd add the following. You know, this is going to be a selection process that focuses on loyalty and confidence in execution of Trump's instincts and policies. Who you're not going to see are the likes of Jim Mattis, Mark Esper, Rex Tillerson, John Bolton, General McMaster, people who pushed against Trump's instincts and desires. This is going to be all about loyalty. So I don't really see much room for Senator Rubio, Mike Pompeo, or Senator Cotton, because they're independent-minded. They could bring their own agenda. and particularly when it comes to Department of Defense and Department of State, which the previous Trump administration found had great frustration with. They felt that the deep state was embedded in these organizations. So they're going to be picking people more along the lines of Grinnell and Waltz and Miller and Haggerty than Rubio, Pompeo, or Cotton.
Now, let me ask you something that's really concerning, of course, in this region. How do you see Trump's approach to Ukraine potentially impacting the security landscape here in Europe? I mean, what scenarios could we be really looking at here? Like, could we see a reduction in military aid?
Well, I'll start this way. We know what Trump has said. He said he believes that Ukraine launched this war. Ukraine's ambitions to join NATO provoked Putin into attacking. We know that that Trump has complained frequently about the amount of assistance going to Ukraine. He held up assistance before. We know that he looks at Ukraine as largely Russia's invasion of Ukraine as largely a European vice a U.S. or transatlantic problem. He hasn't himself been much more specific than that. But when you listen to his Vice President-elect J.D. Vance and people around Trump, you can you can game out a scenario in which Trump, in his first 100 days, might go to President Putin and say, hey, cease and desist, accept a ceasefire, otherwise I'll arm the Ukrainians to the teeth. And then he would go to the Ukrainians, say, President Zelensky, cease and desist, accept a ceasefire, otherwise I'll stop assistance to you. Well, that would be a deal that I think Putin would grab quickly because it would buy him time, he would dig in, he would reconstitute, and he would position himself for a further attack against Ukraine, if not elsewhere in Europe. Another part of the deal that you hear from people around Trump is forcing Ukraine to accept permanent neutrality, which of course would be stripping Ukraine a bit of its sovereignty and leaving it vulnerable to future Russian aggression. That's what you hear. But you got to remember, you never know with Trump. He doesn't always do, he often doesn't do what he says he'll do.
Right, he's unpredictable.
So for my European friends, I said this is now a time to engage the Trump transition team to try and shape its perceptions.
In what ways could Trump's new administration here alter the current U.S. commitment to NATO?
Well, I don't believe that Trump is focusing, certainly in the early part of his administration, on stripping the United States out of NATO. I think he's got a broader agenda. And it'll be a disruptive agenda. It'll be tariffs right across the board for the EU. It'll be a shift in the Middle East of full support behind Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, in his battle against Hamas and Hezbollah. It'll be a reduced focus of attention on a two-state, maybe even an abandonment of a two-state solution. It'll be an effort to significantly increase pressure on Iran, sanctions, really heavy sanctions on Iran. That would be very disruptive to the context. Climate change, he'll pull us out of the climate change agreement, Paris Accords, right away. That would be very disruptive. On NATO, what he'll come in early on is asking for another increase in defense spending, pushing national defense spending to an equivalent of 3.5, if not 4%. And what he'll do damage to NATO is by what he will probably do on Ukraine, trying to force perhaps an unfair solution to this brutal invasion. And I think that would do a lot of damage to the credibility of the United States and therefore the credibility of NATO and its security commitment.
Mr. Brzezinski, and just very briefly, what about how might Trump's presidency impact the global balance of power, especially with countries like China and Russia?
If the president brings an agenda that is disruptive to its most important security and economic relationships, he will weaken the balance of power between the United States and its key adversaries.
Thank you so much, Ian Brzezinski, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for being with us here on World News Tonight on TVP World.
Thank you.
Pleasure speaking to you. And that's all for this edition of World News Tonight here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.